Okay, last part of chapter 4. Can I take one more look at the rhinoceros beetles? Darkus asked, crossing the room to get his red book. No, it's time to go, Uncle Max said firmly, looking him in the eye. Right now. Okay, Darkus nodded, wondering if it was the yellow ladybird that had made his uncle so desperate to leave. No one can enter these rooms without an appointment, right? Uncle Max said to Margaret. She nodded. Well, no one except the sponsor. That's what I was afraid of, Uncle Max muttered, handing Darkus the reading glasses. You better keep a tight hold of these. You found them after all, and Barty's going to need them when he gets home. He heard Darkus through the door. Shouldn't we tell the police about the glasses, Max? Margaret asked as he pushed Darkus past her into the corridor. I don't think so. Uncle Max shook his head and pulled a reassuring face. If anything really useful crops up, I'll let them know. Oh, okay. Margaret closed the vault door and took out her keys to lock it. Well, it was very kind of you to let us see the room, but we must be getting on, Maggie. Uncle Max moved backwards down the hall. Wait, Margaret took a folder from her shoulder bag. I don't know if this will help, but these are the papers Barty had in the vault with him. The police scanned them and returned them to me, assuming they were museum business. The top letter is addressed to the museum, but the rest of the notes are in Barty's handwriting, and I don't recognise the subject matter. Perhaps a personal project? I thought you should have them. Thank you, Maggie. Uncle Max took the file and tucked it under his armpit. That's very thoughtful. Darkus looked at the folder. It said Faber Project on it. At the back of his mind, he knew that he'd seen those words before, but he couldn't quite put his finger on where. It really is lovely to see you, Maggie. Uncle Max covered Margaret's hand with his own. Thank you for letting us into the vault. It means a lot to Darkus and to me. He paused. Perhaps you'd like to have dinner some evening. Margaret flushed with pleasure and gave a little nod as she stared down at Uncle Max's hand on hers. You'll let me know if you hear anything, she whispered. Of course. Uncle Max kissed her hand. Darkus was unimpressed. Onwards, Uncle Max pointed, and Darkus followed his order, disappearing down the corridor before there was any more kissing. Eddie let them out through the same door, and they stopped briefly to say goodbye. Then Uncle Max hurried Darkus past the dinosaur exhibition and towards the exit. What's the rush? Darkus said. Just a hunch, lad, but I'd rather not wait around to see if I'm right, Uncle Max replied, not explaining himself. Darkus rolled his eyes and tried to keep up. As they rushed through the Hintsey Hall, past the giant Diplodocus skeleton and through the open doors of the main entrance, there was a terrific screeching sound, and Darkus saw a stunning black car drive up the pedestrianised driveway. People dived out of the way, grabbing onto their children and pulling them to safety. Darkus cried out as Uncle Max suddenly dragged him backwards through the nearest doorway into what turned out to be a disabled toilet. What are you doing? He shouted, alarmed. Shh! Uncle Max calmly put his finger to his lips. He opened the door a sliver and peered through the gap into the entrance hall of the museum. 2 sparkling black sticks appeared, and then a woman's head, jet black hair, gold lips, and then her body came lurching into view, leaning on the sticks. She wore a white laboratory coat over a long black dress, and every jarring movement of her body screamed out how angry she was. Where is he? She shouted at the unfortunate young man behind the information desk. Who? He quivered. The snivelling director of this rotting institution. She lifted a hand from its stick, which hung from a loop around her wrist, and smashed it down onto the counter. He's let someone into my vault. Ah, Madam Cutter, came a terrified voice, accompanied by the pattering of hurried footsteps. To what do we owe this honour? Shut up, she barked. Take me downstairs immediately. There's someone in my vault. I can assure you, Madam Cutter, that cannot be true. No one can enter the Coleoptera vaults without an appointment. We do not permit the public to enter the collection rooms. Don't tell me what's true and what isn't, she snarled. Take me downstairs now. Of course, forgive me. A trembling, bold man came into view, and Darkus saw that it was Mr. Langley, Dad's boss and the director of the museum. He was sweating so much that Darkus could see it dripping off his nose. He looked at Uncle Max, who still had his finger pressed against his lips. Follow me, Mr. Langley gestured. Madam Cutter stalked past him. Oh, of course, you know the way. I'll follow you, shall I? Darkus pushed his eye to the crack in the door and saw a chauffeur, a short Chinese woman, following several paces behind Madam Cutter. Behind them stumbled Mr. Langley, tripping over his own feet. Who was that? Darkus asked. Uncle Max drew in a long breath. That is Lucretia Cutter, and she is bad news. The Cutter Coleoptera collection woman? The very one. So we were the ones in her vault. That was us, Uncle Max nodded. But how did she know we were in there? Darkus asked. I didn't see any cameras unless... How indeed, Uncle Max replied, poking his head out of the toilet door when he was certain Lucretia Cutter had gone. He motioned for Darkus to follow him. Business as usual, he said, straightening his safari hat and giving his nephew a reassuring smile. They walked calmly out of the museum as if nothing had happened. As they passed Madame Cutter's car, Darkus couldn't help but stare at it. It was iridescent black, and where the light bounced off its body, it shimmered green and purple. It was a classic shape that looked as if it had driven right out of one of his comics. The windows were tinted like cars in the movies, and Darkus thought he saw the outline of a girl's face pressed against the back window. He stopped walking, but Uncle Max grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "Keep moving," he whispered softly. Once they were round the corner and heading away from the museum, Uncle Max relaxed the pace. "Are you okay?" he asked. Darkus nodded. "I think so." "Marvellous." Uncle Max pulled out his car keys. "I must say it was a good job you spotted that yellow ladybird, or we would be in all sorts of hot water now." Darkus thought back to the yellow ladybird and Baxter's peculiar behaviour in the jam jar. It wasn't him that had spotted the ladybird, it was Baxter. The beetle had been trying to warn him. Why? Was the ladybird something to do with Lucretia Cutter woman? It was also Baxter who'd found Dad's reading glasses. Darkus frowned as he played through everything that had happened in that room. It wouldn't have been so odd if a dog had barked at the ladybird or found the glasses, but a beetle? He'd never heard of a beetle or any insect warning humans of danger. He wondered, not for the first time, about where Baxter had really come from before he ended up in the trouser leg of the ogre next door. Uncle Max opened the car, slid into the driving seat and reached over to open the passenger door for Darkus. As Darkus got in, he took off his backpack and unzipped it to check on Baxter. The beetle appeared to be sleeping. It was hard to tell when he was asleep because he didn't have eyelids. But his legs were very still, and Darkus took that as a sign that he was resting. Uncle Max slotted the key into the ignition and the car started first time. He clapped his hands together in glee. "That couldn't have gone any better, really, could it?" "Start in the car?" Darkus asked. "Or in the museum?" "All of it. We found We found Barty's glasses, drew the villain out from her lair." "Villain?" "We may not know how Barty disappeared, lad, or where he is, but you can bet your breeches that viper of a woman had something to do with it." He waggled his eyebrows, "and to top it all off, I've got a dinner date with the lovely Maggie."